Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to give folks a couple more minutes to get logged in, and then we'll kick things off. All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you again for joining us for today's webinar. A couple quick housekeeping items before we kick things off. We are recording today's session, and we'll follow up with you with the full recording as well as the full 2021 Restaurant Ops Report ebook. And with that, we also have Q&A throughout, so please submit your questions via the Q&A panel in GoToWebinar. And we'll try to reserve some time at the end to hit those questions. With that, I'm going to pass things over to today's moderator, Chief Marketing Officer of Zenput, Dave Carroll.
Thank you, Cassie, and hi, everyone. So as Cassie mentioned, I'm Dave Carroll. I head up marketing at Zenput. Great to have you with us for today's webinar, which is going to be a great one. I'm joined by two individuals who are in conversations with operators like yourselves every day. We have Melissa Wilson, who is a principal with Technomic's advisory practice, and Nikki Perry, who is head of sales here at Zenput. So in today's session, very excited about this. Melissa is going to present findings from a brand new joint research study. This was a collaboration between Zenput and Technomic. And the study we ran just a few weeks ago, it's fresh findings. We ran this back in February. Where we were aiming with the research, and Melissa's going to drill into this in much more context, give you more context, but we were aiming to get a fresh pulse on the top operations challenges facing the industry. And very specifically, we were looking to see what are the things that are getting in the way of team execution at the headquarter level, at the field level, and in the restaurants. And then we're also looking to uncover where are operators prioritizing initiatives to serve customers in new ways to drive growth as we all look beyond the pandemic. So as mentioned up front, please feel free to submit questions as we go so you can be part of the dialogue. I'm going to try to find good spots to break in with those questions. And we'll have some time at the end as well. So with that, Nikki and Melissa, let me pass the mic to you just to introduce yourselves a little more fully. Melissa, should we start with you?
Sure, thanks. And thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. Dave, very much appreciate you and the team at Zenput inviting me here today to present key findings from our co-authored study. I'm a principal with Technomic, as Dave mentioned, and I lead, I've been with the firm about 17 years, and I head up our operator advisory, off-premise, and technology practice areas.
Awesome. Thanks, Melissa. Nikki, you want to jump in?
Yeah, and echo the same. Thank you all for spending your afternoon or morning, depending on where you are with us. So as Dave mentioned, I lead our go-to-market team here. So what that means is for the past 4.5 years, I've had the great pleasure of talking to food service operators every single day about their goals and initiatives around operations execution, whether it's they're trying to become more productive within their workforce or they're trying to level up their quality and execution around their daily procedures. So near and dear to my heart and something that I love to talk about all the time.
All right, well, you're going to get a chance to do that amply today. All right, Melissa, let's dive in. I'll turn it over to you to set the stage here.
Great, sounds great. And thanks, Dave, for sharing an overview of the overall objectives of the study. Really the overarching goals to provide that state of operations execution and the challenges that all of you operators that are listening in are facing, as well as understanding the changes that you've made during the pandemic and what those look like moving forward, what's expected to become permanent. We fielded the study in February of 2021, and it was just completed, about 4 or 5 weeks ago. So very fresh data. And then in terms of who was surveyed, really the whole audience was those who have operational decision-making responsibilities, like those who are listening, and include a mix of VPs and director of operations, C-level executives, district regional managers, and operations managers, as well as owner-operators. The responses came from both limited and full-service restaurants, including both franchise and company-operated chains, with a mix of chain sizes from those running 10 locations to those with more than 250 plus locations. So let's dive into what our key findings were. And the very first finding was that many of the operational changes that were brought on by the pandemic look like they are here to stay. No questions, not a surprise to anybody that's listening in on this session, that the industry had to rapidly implement, you had to rapidly implement a lot of new processes. And the data clearly shows 2/3 rolled out employee temperature checks, 62% enhanced sanitation procedures, to adding things like contactless options for customer service, adding contactless options such as delivery service and curbside pickup, even though those may not have been initiatives before the pandemic. But one of the notable findings is that in addition to these contactless options for customers, operators also reduced in-person contact between team members and adapted a lot of internal operational procedures to keep the team safer as well. Half said that they held fewer or no in-person meetings, and almost half switched to online training and implemented digital checklists. 4 out of 10 said that their district regional operations managers were either working remotely or visiting stores much less often. So we then asked operators, of the changes that you've made during the pandemic, which do you expect to become permanent, not just staying in place as we come out of the pandemic, but permanent moves going forward? And overall, the plans that the industry is thinking about are calling for the majority of these changes to become permanent. No question, enhanced cleaning is here to stay. 84% of operators said that they would keep their new sanitation procedures. In addition, the time and investments that have been made in newer technology-driven processes, like digital checklists and online training, that will be central to operations in the future, overwhelming majority, 82%, that they plan to keep those new digitized checklists, and 2/3 are now planning to keep training online. So a lot of interesting findings here.
Yeah, no doubt. So Melissa, there's a lot of data here. So what surprised you most in terms of what you're seeing here? Like, did you expect certain changes to have more staying power?
Yeah, great question. First and foremost, the pandemic really accelerated changes in certain areas where our industry, let's face it, has lagged other industries, such as greater integration of technology in areas like checklists and online training. And although third-party delivery was pretty well entrenched before the pandemic, there's some industry segments, especially in full service, that had remained focused on traditional takeout and hadn't yet implemented contactless options like digital ordering, had to quickly adapt to those. So, major kudos are deserved when you think about how quickly this industry was able to make some of these changes. In terms of staying power, there's no question that the enhanced sanitation procedures and the monitoring of those are here to stay. In our research at Technomic with consumers, they're telling us resoundingly that they really need to see those visible sanitation activities. Some are calling it cleaning theater, but it really is essential to keep consumers feeling comfortable and safe in an indoor environment moving forward. And they're also telling us that that could be a key brand decision driver in the future. So operators clearly are telling us that they're hearing this and are planning to keep those types of initiatives in place. Increased usage of off-premise formats, of course, major shifts for some operators, as I mentioned, especially full service. No question that operators across all segments are saying that they plan to continue maintaining and enhancing their off-premise programs, because off-premise growth is certainly looking to continue. But to your question, Dave, the biggest surprise to us related to the removal of our industry's historic insistence that everything has to be done in person. Companies across many industries have come to realize this. We read about this in the press all the time. But we all know that in-store visits and in-person training have always been the way that things are done in the restaurant industry. So The broader shift to more remote oversight, such as less travel for district and regional operations management and fewer in-person meetings, now looks like they're being embraced by the restaurant industry too, with almost half saying that district regional ops management will be working remotely and visiting stores less often, and a third saying they would continue with fewer in-person meetings. And as I mentioned a moment ago, that with that shift to online training, 2/3 that have made that shift are planning to keep online training versus in-person. So that was the biggest surprise, is this embrace of the remote work culture in the restaurant industry.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Nikki, I'm curious, like we have this, we went out and got a survey of, a set of responders who kind of gave us some insights. How does this map to the conversations you're having every day with operators? And any thoughts on kind of which of these that Melissa's teed up here would outlast the pandemic?
Yeah. So first off, I want to give a huge round of applause to the restaurant brands and frontline workers for how quickly you all really did pivot to maintain and provide a really safe environment for consumers and your team members during what was a really hard time. But as far as the changes that, I'm hearing from our customers and the operators that we're talking to on an everyday basis, I agree with a lot of what Melissa has said. I'm hearing from just about everyone that we work with right now that heightened focus on sanitation and team member health is not going anywhere. Not only is this trend being driven by consumer demand, which is something that Melissa highlighted, it's also being driven by the employee workforce. Employee working conditions and safety became a big area of focus during the pandemic. And from what we're hearing from our customers, it will continue to persist as the fight for talent becomes more strained. Melissa touched a little bit on the need to engage and meet your consumer where they want to, which we agree, I think, is here to stay as well. This drives the consumer interaction outside of the traditional restaurant by leveraging third-party delivery services and even ghost kitchens. We've seen a lot of brands start to experiment with this concept, and I think we'll continue to invest. The brands that not only survived but thrived during the pandemic figured out how to maximize this channel while still preserving the food quality that they're known for. So this means that rigorous training and testing on these new procedures, along with bringing agility into the menu, are top initiatives that we're discussing with operators every day. And lastly, the concept of remote operations is here to stay. It is a very interesting shift and in perspective, and provides a really unique opportunity to begin to actually elevate the role of restaurant general manager. Last week, I must have met with 3 different national brands on how they can leverage technology to truly embrace remote operations by empowering that general manager a bit more with easier access to information about their store's performance and facilitating fluid communication between field teams and store teams.
That's great. Thank you. All right, Melissa, I think we've got a lot of unpacking to do, so let's move on to the next theme.
We do. Let's dig into let's dig into some of the rest of this study. They're just fascinating findings. So, the second, top finding from the study was that the majority of restaurant operators are now using technology to execute core processes. And, this is the 3rd year in a row that Zenput has conducted this restaurant operations survey and restaurant operations report. And we've partnered with them the past 2 years. We compared the data from last year, and the jump is just so significant. It's amazing. 44% of operators now say they're using tech to a great extent to automate aspects of their operation, compared to 27% said the same last year. That's a massive shift. And when we look at how critical tasks are being tracked, we see that we asked them a number of ways in which they might be using to manage and track a variety of operational processes: software apps, paper checklists, identifying how many aren't tracked and recorded, or other methods, whether it just happens to be for verbal conversations, etc. Software and apps are being used most often for things like inventory, 71% said that. 2/3 are using them for make line and storage temp checks. Almost 2/3 as well, 63% for production sheets. But just as interesting, we still see paper still being very used heavily by many operators for things such as sanitation and cleaning procedure checklists. In that arena, almost half our reports still using paper checklists.
All right, so maybe on that note, because that's the thing that just kind of grabbed us when we were looking at the data and some of the contrast. Were you surprised that so many respondents reported still being so reliant on paper, like paper checklists, given the previous slide where you see the kind of this big move forward to embrace automation?
Well, yes and no. You know, as we mentioned before, the restaurant industry has traditionally lagged in adopting technology for a wide variety of reasons, from concern about expense, from concern about disrupting operations as you change over, from honestly, a lot of operators tell us they just don't know where to start looking. That started to shift a few years ago, really based on consumer demand and expectations for that easy digital ordering process that they've become accustomed to in every other industry that they're making purchases from. So as the interest and adoption of technology started to grow a few years before the pandemic, the initial focus primarily has been on that customer-facing technology like digital ordering. So we weren't surprised to find paper checklists still in use, but the high levels of paper checklist use in certain areas that could be considered mission critical, that can impact operational readiness and cost, was surprising. And tasks for which documentation is important, or that some regulatory bodies might require, such as sanitation checklists and employee wellness checks, that might have been understandable if the survey had been done last year, right when those procedures were first being implemented, but we're a year later and we know that some documentation is essential in those arenas. So we were surprised that so many operators are still using paper for these types of tasks.
All right, thanks, Melissa. So Nikki, kind of same thing. So what's your reaction to these kind of, there's a mix, there's kind of like two sides to the story. There's this increased technology use, but paper checklists continuing to be used. From your vantage point, is this just inertia, or is there a reason more of the industry hasn't already embraced the digitization of process checklists or procedures from your perspective?
Yeah. So, I think it's easiest to transition from paper to digital when you first start with something like the district manager or general manager walkthroughs. Operators see the immediate benefit in the documentation, notifying others on the team of crucial non-compliance, and using things like photos to be precise on the areas that need to be corrected. When you start getting into the handling of food, such as temp checks, production sheets, some of these other procedures, it's a much bigger adjustment in the organization. So I think it's natural for operators to focus on the easiest to implement first, but digitizing food operations to the fullest extent will ultimately give operators their biggest return. Once people see the benefit of how the data can better help them manage the operation or increase productivity and efficiencies, we will start to see an uptick and movement into these areas. It's already happening. From what we're seeing across our customer base, operators are starting to tackle this need, beginning with digitizing temperature checks. I think the biggest reason we're seeing rapid adoption in this area is the visibility it gives management across all of those locations, allowing them to really quickly address potential lapses at a store, but doing it by exception. Also, I think as many of you on the call probably experience, many local and state regulatory agencies are looking for this documentation that Melissa mentioned, and paper gets lost. I mean, quite frankly, it's now become almost a liability. So if field leader visits are becoming less frequent, like what we're predicting will happen with the heightened focus on remote operations, digitizing this work will allow the field leader and home office teams to have better line of sight into the stores they support. So I suspect, based upon the trends that we've seen, the improvement that we saw from last year to this year, when we review this survey, we will be having a very different conversation in early 2022.
All right, there's Nikki's crystal ball. We shall see. We shall see. All right, Melissa, so here we're talking about the kind of processes and kind of where technology is playing. So I think we're going to shift into like, how do people think we're doing with these processes, the confidence and the quality of the work?
Yeah, and the finding here is, there's kind of chagrin and concern around this one, is that operators tell us that they lack confidence that critical tasks are executed correctly and on time. And there's a lot to unpack in this data here. So no question, there's a long list of things involved in operating a restaurant on a daily basis and on every shift. And when you look at the time required by each, most take between 15 and 20 minutes or so, but are of course completed multiple times per day. So let's taking a look at on this slide, the average amount of time being spent on certain tasks. So over 2 hours a day being spent on food prep labeling. The sanitation and cleaning checklists, which are mostly new procedures implemented over the past year, almost an hour and a half a day. Employee wellness checks, we know that's a new procedure since the past year, almost 3/4 of an hour. So between the two of those, that's another 2+ hours a day. So when we analyze the data from this study, these metrics about how long each task takes and the number of times that it's performed per day, and by the way, for those of you listening, these will be some great benchmarks for you to use to compare to your own operational processes. But on average, it takes about 8.5 labor hours per day being spent to complete these tasks. Now, that's a lot of time, a lot of labor costs, a lot of to-dos for the managers and staff. And this is really relevant and a big concern with the staffing challenges that the industry is facing right now. It's so important to understand where time is being lost, what can be automated, where team can save time. So having this data in front of you can help you understand and see where you can perhaps reallocate some of that time. A key question that leaders have is, is the work being done? Is it being done on time? And back to our overarching headline on this finding is the data says that operators just don't necessarily know. Only half were very confident that food prep labeling is being done right, even though in the last slide that we showed, that now accounts for 2 hours of work per day. So big concern here.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it is the first, I know as a company, the previous slide where we're looking at the time, I know in a lot of our conversations, it's kind of an unknown. I think it's actually illuminating just to see with a shift of workers in the time that you have to give out, like how much is consumed by your standard operating procedures. So that was kind of illuminating as we started to talk with customers about that. So what as you look at this, what stands out most, Melissa? And you mentioned, and we are having some questions like on the staffing crunch and kind of how that might have reflected in the survey. But given the current staffing challenges, what do you see as the biggest implication of the time that's spent here in different areas, or just the magnitude of time being spent?
Yeah, first of all, get to your point. I think having these benchmarks I think that's a really important finding from this study. Because I don't think many listening may have had those in their organization to look at before. So really important. And what struck me when we think about the labor challenges the industry is facing right now, what really came to mind is some recent discussions that we at Technomic have had over the past month with our operator advisory board. There's no question that labor and staffing is the number one topic on the mind right now of everybody in the industry. But beyond the concerns for labor cost or for ensuring that the work is being done right and on time, they were all extremely concerned about their managers and teams burning out. They're so short-staffed that those that are working are often working 12 to 14-hour days. Many operators are having to close stores certain days because they don't have team, and those that are working are getting burned out because they're working really long days. So they're really trying to find opportunities to make as much of the day-to-day tasks that have to be done easier to execute to relieve some of that stress. And another comment that really stood out regarding the staffing situation, a few of the operators on our advisory board noted that since their dining rooms have been closed for more than a year, the employees that have been hired since then have never worked for the company when the dining room was open and there were customers in the restaurant. So now they were thinking about they're going to have to relearn their roles and adapt to processes that are new to them, even though they may have been working for the restaurant for 6 months. And of course, when you're stretched that thin, operating really short-staffed and onboarding new team members at the same time as you're able to hire people, it becomes even more of a challenge to be sure that the processes are being trained properly and are being followed and completed on time.
Thanks, Melissa. So, Nikki, let's keep pushing. Since I know it's probably a topic on a lot of the folks' mind around the call, have addressed the staffing issue head on for a little bit more here. What do you think the implications of some of the data you're seeing, based on conversations you're having? What are, I guess specifically, what are the ways you see customers using technology as we see there's like a big jump year over year in embracing technology? Specifically, how are they using technology potentially to ease the pain of hiring that we're seeing?
Dave, unfortunately, we are heading into a perfect storm where we have a lack of culture to consistently execute on our critical procedures, as the data in this survey shows us. We have higher turnover due to team members feeling unsafe or unwilling to work, with little to no applicants coming in to replace our workforce, a field team that is traveling less, and more procedures that need to be done throughout the day. So effectively, we're asking our team members to do more work with fewer team members that have less tenure working with our brand, and we still are expecting them to uphold the quality that we expect. So how are brands trying to tackle this? Well, operators are doing what they always do, and they're getting really creative. And they're doing interesting things like offering a ton of different incentives for interviews and accepting positions. But the number one thing is that we're seeing in all cases is that operators are turning towards technology with the focus around making every employee that they do have way more productive without getting into that burnout factor, and finding unique ways to attract and retain team members by giving them the tools that they need to help them do better at their job and to hopefully make it more enjoyable. So I'll share one example of how technology can explicitly address this. If we focus on actually removing work from their plates, Melissa just ran through some great examples of procedures and how long those items actually take. So how can we get creative and remove some of that off of their plate? We do that by automating and digitizing things like temperature checks and food labeling. So not only does this save time and labor upwards to the tune of 2 hours a day for most of our customers, but it actually ensures the work is being done and captures the critical information, which speaks to the concern that we're looking at here, where operators aren't sure when things are being done or if they're ever being done. So it's 2 wins. We're getting the work done, and we're actually giving our employees a little bit more time back.
Awesome, thanks for that. All right, let us move on, I believe, to the topic of audits. So I think we get into a little bit of trying to make field teams a little more productive and how can the state of that.
Yeah, everybody's favorite word, right? Audits. So, a key, another key finding from the study is that there's certainly, what's the phrase, opportunities for improvement here. So we captured a number of great benchmarks in this study. Again, that those that are listening can compare to what's happening in their own brand. And, a couple of data points that we want to call out here when it comes to those all-important audits. So the average store is typically only audited about 77 times a year. And actually 39%, 4 out of 10 of operators overall, only complete audits quarterly. And what that ultimately means, especially when you think about the shift to some remote operations during the pandemic, is it's hard to know what's really happening in the store the other 358 days of the year. And then follow-ups from the audits are supposed to be a big part of the outcome of audits. If you find something that needs to be adjusted, that's the whole point, correct? Is to ensure that those situations are being corrected and new processes trained in and implemented. But less than half of operators feel very confident that those follow-ups are being done. So, we also asked operators in this study how audits could be made more useful, because if you're going to spend that kind of time on conducting audits, let's make sure that they are being efficient in accomplishing their goals. And 57%, more than half of operators told us that they would like to improve follow-up after audits are being conducted. Some other leading opportunities for improvement were to improve feedback to the store and to use the audit results to prioritize future initiatives. So no question, operators are looking to make the audits themselves and the follow-through on corrective actions more productive.
So there's a lot of data here. So I guess as you and your team dug into it, is there kind of a key takeaway or takeaways on the kind of, if you were to wrap it up for us, like the current state of audits and their effectiveness?
Yeah, well, it's gonna, I may sound a little redundant here, but it's gonna come back to time as well. So one of the other points that really stood out is that district and regional operations managers are spending on average more than 12 hours on an audit, and then another 7 hours to create action plans coming out of the audit. That's a lot of time. And when you're investing that much of a multi-unit operation manager's time, obviously are more highly compensated than store-level staff, conducting an audit, especially in light of the labor shortages that the industry is grappling with, you want to be sure that their time is being used efficiently on the things that matter the most. So, as we mentioned, less than half feel highly confident that action items are being addressed promptly. And that's because likely less than half, you'll see in the data, receive regular reports on the status of those follow-ups. In fact, 1 in 10 said that they don't really know whether action items are being taken care of or not. So given the investment to complete audits and the importance of the process, really operators need to be in a better position to feel confident that those action items are being taken care of.
Nikki, how about you? Philosophically, do you see kind of a shift in how operators are speaking with kind of view audit?
Yeah, listen, auditing is a part of the bedrock of this industry, and I don't think it's going anywhere. But as we can see, there is a push to change the traditional paradigm of an audit. Typically, audits are being completed by our field leaders who are high-value employees. And as we can see in this survey, they spend entirely too much time processing audits and chasing the follow-up. So a major conversation that I'm having with operators today is how can we actually shift their field team from being an auditor to a coach by giving them the ability to leverage more consistent data coming from the restaurant itself instead of having to rely on the 4 to 7 times they're in a restaurant a year. By doing things like digitizing the standard operating procedures and including photo verification. And then when they do have to audit, automating that feedback loop when the audit is conducted with an intelligent action plan that does not require that field leader to spend 7 hours creating the plan. That is so much time. So by leveraging data and automation, we can get more insights more frequently with less manual work, therefore actually allowing our field teams to make that transition into coaching their stores and up-leveling the brand as a whole. So as I mentioned, I don't think audits are going anywhere, but they should be done maybe less frequently and reserved for restaurants that are not performing consistently or for extreme violations of our critical procedures.
Great. All right, thanks for that. So let's now turn to a pretty important topic. I think we're going to talk about food safety a little bit and kind of what the respondents had to say about that.
Yeah, absolutely, and really big findings here, and again, very, very concerning findings. The study is showing us that operators really not equipped to detect or correct food safety concerns quickly, and certainly with all of the focus on the pandemic, we've been thinking about team safety, customer safety, health and wellness, but food safety has always been paramount for our industry as well. And, 2 key stats that came out of the research that really stand out, notice on the left, 61% of operators are very confident in their ability to identify food safety concerns. Well, some might say that's the majority, but note our word phrase only, it's only 61% of operators are confident in their availability. And this is something that is so critical to the restaurant industry and to your brand. But even more problematic is less than half of operators, once they've detected a potential food safety concern, feel confident that they can correct that in less than 24 hours.
Yeah, that's super interesting. What's your take? There's obviously, like, we're staring at two data points, which seem a little bit, I know contradictory might be too strong, but what's your take on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, in a word, our reaction and the team's exact words when we got the data around food safety back was that the results were abysmal. At first glance, that 61%, a majority, might seem like good news, but the reality is, in our industry, this is something that 100% of operators offering food service should agree with, that we can identify a food safety concern. And the ability to correct quickly, well, maybe asking for a correction in a day, maybe that's, best in class, but almost a third said that they would need at least 4 days to correct a food safety problem once it's identified. And when you think of the volume of customers ordering from restaurants on a daily basis, even during these pandemic times, taking more than 1 day to correct food safety concerns really can put thousands of customers at risk. So the bottom line is the findings tell us that far too many operators don't have the systems in place or the confidence in their current operating procedures to identify and correct these areas of concern quickly in a really critical area for the industry.
Got it. Nikki, on your end, with so much on the minds of operators, including those on the call, do you see food safety remaining a top concern, like a top topic in the conversations you're having? And what are some of the ways you're seeing operators kind of staying a couple of steps ahead of issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, food safety is at the core of every operator's mission when I speak with them. I think the reality is, and everyone knows this, it's not a matter of if there will be a food safety incident at a restaurant, but instead it's a matter of when and how well equipped are you to respond to it. So to this effect, every operator initially begins to engage with us in a very simple manner. And that's by digitizing their food safety procedures in some way. The easiest step to take down this journey is to really start by digitizing and bringing more visibility into your temperature checks, right? Things like your make line checks and whatnot. From there, brands start to take the next step, which is to introduce more automation and actually removing the need for a team member to do things like document the temperatures of equipment, ambient air, and food that's being held somewhere. By removing that human element, we gain more control over these critical control points, and we free up our team members' time to focus on our guests, which has been a common theme we've been talking about. I think the last area we see people starting to invest in is really streamlining their food prep labeling process. Mislabeled expiration dates is a top 5 common violation found during most food safety audits, so it's a big area of improvement. So these strategies really do better equip operators to get ahead of food safety issues and to respond when one does occur.
All right, and I think as we hit our next topic, as we kind of our home stretch here, a big part, I assume, of solving food safety issues and other is around best-in-class communications. So how are we doing around communications?
Yeah, well, this is an area that, one could almost say that the industry's overperforming. I feel like we've been beating up a little bit with the things that we're concerned about, but headquarters to store communication is certainly frequent. What operators told us is that headquarters is sending an average of 35 communications to stores each month on topics, not a surprise this past year, safety and hygiene, food safety, as well as just overall news and reminders, policies and procedures, etc. But less than half are extremely confident in the effectiveness of that communication. You can see that stat there. Only 40% feel that that's being effectively communicated. So, when we look at what they're communicating about, a lot of critical issues as well as perhaps some things that are not quite as critical. So let's take a look at how are they communicating. on this frequent level. And again, here's a little bit of an eye chart, but we asked them, we're using email, in-person, phone, software apps, mail, SMS, text, etc. So email is still the predominant form of headquarters to store communication, but you can see that it's really spread across the board with in-person, phone, software apps being used 20-25% of the time for various types of communications. And Dave, we have you on mute.
So Melissa, I actually have a question about this.
Sure.
It sounds like there is very frequent communication between headquarters and the stores. Isn't that a good thing?
Well, that's a great question. And by the way, ironic communication, we're talking about communication. So more isn't necessarily better. And I think if we ask the store level staff, they'd probably say, no, that isn't necessarily better. You know, the key finding that I mentioned that stood out to us is less than half, only 40% of operators are highly confident that these are effective. And that could be from sending too many communications too frequently. But the other thing that the research really highlighted was the formats that they're using. So although email is the most prevalent, in-person and telephone communications, as I noted, were widely used. And that can make it really challenging either to confirm that the message has been shared with all the team members or to flag it for follow-up.
Yeah. I know when I've done store ride-alongs or visits and actually have spoken to a lot of the end users, right, the team members in the stores who are receiving these communications, having to go across all these different channels is really confusing and creates a really disjointed experience. And oftentimes ends up meaning that messages are missed, right? We like to think that every communication is absolutely critical and that they're going to be on top of it, but that isn't always the case when we spread it across so many different vehicles. It also puts a lot of strain on the general manager because oftentimes they become the single point of that communication. And it's their responsibility to share that message across all of their different team members who oftentimes span 3 to 4 different shifts. So it's not a surprise that this is maybe not viewed as effective as it could. So something that's interesting, when I speak with operators about their communication strategy, I think there's a big desire to find a single source to have that communication go through. But the challenge is really in figuring out what the right single source is. And so in order to do that, organizations need to figure out what is the nature of their communication. Do you mostly communicate around general news? Is it mostly intended to instruct others on things that they need to execute upon? Or is it to provide a social outlet for employees? So what I've seen specifically in this industry and in talking to our customers is that most of this need to communicate is really there to subsequently drive another user to execute upon the information that was communicated. And this is actually validated in the survey results, right? 2 of the top reasons for communication was around safety, hygiene, and food safety. Oftentimes, this information includes changes to a procedure or notice of new procedures that will be rolled out. So what I've seen inside of operators who are really leading the charge in effective communications is that they've chosen to communicate through the same platform that helps their team members execute against their daily procedures. One, this platform is generally widely available to all employees, so it removes that strain from the restaurant manager, but it also really helps to bridge the communication to the actual execution that they're ultimately there to drive.
That's great. I'm back, by the way, I think. Can you guys hear me?
Welcome back.
Again.
All right, good. I got
Perfect
booted.
time.
I got booted from audio. All right, so I think we're going to take out our crystal ball. And I guess we asked everyone in the survey to take out their crystal ball and talk a little bit about kind of where they think the hockey puck's going and where they're investing in their priorities.
Yeah, so again, last of the overarching findings, so many data and insights to dig into with this study, but looking into the rest of this year and beyond, when we asked operators what their most important priorities were over the next 6 to 12 months, top priorities: number one, to implement new technology. At almost half of operators said that was their number one. And then ensuring customer and employee safety. Now, I think it's interesting that implementing new technology was a higher priority actually than that. And I think that speaks to all the reasons that we've been giving behind why operators are saying that there's some challenges out there and technology can help support that. And not surprisingly, based on certainly what we've been talking about with the labor challenges with the in the industry, recruiting qualified staff and ensuring that they have sufficient staffing levels. And then in terms of how they intend to invest in technology, we also asked that. So employee performance tracking leads the list with 43% saying that that was the number one area of investment. And then we really rounded out. There were a top 5 that really stood out here, with food safety, temperature and tracking, employee training, sanitization, and inventory tracking, all rounding out that top 5 as the bigger priorities for tech investment over the next 12 months.
All right, that's great. So we're just about at time. So Nikki, I'm going to give you the last word here, just to kind of reflect on some of this data. So I'm curious, where do you, based on where the survey responses fell out here, are they consistent? Are they consistent with the conversations you're having in terms of priorities that you're discussing with operators?
Yeah, this really was not surprising to me, especially after reviewing the impact the pandemic had on restaurants last year and the new operating rhythm operators have had to become accustomed to. These results are very reflective of the conversations we're having on a daily basis. Operators are taking this time to invest in their employees through training and technology to really equip them to not only do their job better, but to make them more productive and to bring agility into the organization. Listen, if 2020 taught us one thing, it's that everything can change on a dime and that our employees are invaluable. Organizations who are prioritizing investing in technology that helps them to be more agile and attractive in the labor market are really investing in their future. But by the way, it's not just the day-to-day operators who are embracing this change. We have seen a really big shift in the role of the brand with respect to franchisors and how they are really leaning in to these changes to really help their franchisees tackle this new way of working and really help them find and embrace new technologies.
Thank you. All right, well, I think it's a wrap. So Melissa, thank you very much for kind of bringing this research to life, and Nikki for offering your vantage point. If we just jump to the next slide, just to kind of give you all, you shall all, thank you to everyone taking the time to join. I know it's a really busy time for everyone, so appreciate taking some of that time with us. You'll all be receiving a follow-up with recording of this webinar if you care to share with your colleagues, as well as we'll put in your inbox shortly a copy of this report, which has a lot more data. So if some of that benchmark data, I know it's hard to grab all the detail as we're going quickly through it. So you'll have that available to you and again to share with colleagues as you'd like. So thank you again and have a great rest of the day.